We're live now.
Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Kim, the Director of the Center for the Advancement of the Humanities. I want to thank all of you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to attend to this very important topic and the conversations that we'll be having over the next hour and a half or so. To begin with, I wanted to just say a little bit about our grant. This is a grant that's funded in part from the Wisconsin Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Wisconsin Humanities strengthens the roots of community life through educational and cultural programs that inspire civic participation and individual imagination. Before handing things over to our moderator for this evening, Pardeep Kalika, I wanted to just say a little bit about how this grant came together. The title of this grant is Interfaith Dialogue and Community Engagement Amidst the Pandemic. And our purpose was to convene humanities experts, religious leaders, and community members to spark conversation about the history and potential of interfaith engagement to promote justice and peace in Milwaukee. The concept is inspired by the original Muslim-Christian dialogue group that first met in Milwaukee over 4 decades ago. By exploring lessons drawn from the group's historical role, our conversations will allow for reflection about new models of engagement between community and interfaith groups that pursue religious and social commitments during and in the aftermath of COVID-19. This project considers how challenges to communities related to the pandemic have been addressed by interfaith partners and aims to deepen understanding about how communities can promote nonviolence, peacemaking, forgiveness, and justice. These conversations will provide a history of interfaith engagement and encourage new efforts to address challenges caused by the current pandemic and inform responses to future crises. These conversations will highlight the transformative teachings and practices within Islam and Christianity while deepening the community's understanding of how to examine and use faith and knowledge to promote the common good. So some of you joining us might have also been present for our first event on August 5th. And in tonight's event, we continue some of the themes and discussions begun in that event. We have 2 subsequent events, one in November and one in February, which I'll be placing in the chat as we go. So thank you again so much for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator for tonight, Pardeep Kalika.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. And thank you everyone that is tuning in tonight. Good evening. Welcome everyone. In the matter of religion and faith can often conjure up feelings of disagreement and divisiveness. These disagreements can cause conflict, keep communities apart, and friendships, cause tension, and justify violence against one another. We have a history that points to the many examples of that. However, if we take a closer look at the many religions of the world, we would see that many of our faiths share very much in common, very much in common, such as compassion, love, humility, service to the poor and needy, and the centering of our spiritual beliefs to lead us to live our lives in the sincere reverence to God and a higher power. We would also see that many of our faiths also share similar doctrines, traditions, and key figures. There's no place that this is more clear than when we look at the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. 3 of the world's most populous faiths and 3 religions who have shared in centuries of both bloodshed and bitterness, while also sharing many things in common. For instance, the adherents of these 3 faiths are all considered people of the book because they share a common heritage and many of the same figures and the ultimate belief in the same God. Tonight, we will take an in-depth look into the shared figures between Islam and Christianity, specifically the life of Abraham, Hagar, Mary, and Jesus. We will ask the questions, do we have more to fight over than more in common? And who are the people? Who are those that can bring us together in these divided times? For those that are on the chat, please direct your questions to those that you would want to ask the question to. So if you have a question for, let's say, Janan, please direct the question to Janan and then ask the question. Jorge will filter those questions and we will ask them later on. So without further ado, I want to introduce our amazing panel of speakers tonight. Dr. Irfan Omar is the Associate Professor of Theology at Marquette University, where he teaches courses on Islamic theology, peace studies, and interreligious dialogue. His research areas include Sufism and South Asian studies. He has edited several volumes, including Interfaith Engagement in Milwaukee, A Brief History of Christian and Muslim Dialogue, co-edited with Caton Daly, and Peacemaking and the Challenge of Violence in World Religions, co-edited with Michael Duffy. He currently serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies and the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. He will be covering Hagar. Caton Daly is a registered nurse and current PhD student at Duke University School of Nursing. Her research interests focus on the intersections of food, faith, and health, particularly exploring church-based health promotion interventions as an avenue to reduce diet-related racial health disparities. Caitlin continues to work with Dr. Irfan Omar to tell the story of interfaith efforts in Milwaukee. Caitlin received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Marquette University in 2017 with double majors in nursing and theology and religion. She will also be covering Hagar. Ms. Janan Najib is the founding member and current president of the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Coalition. She has been a longtime spokesperson for the Milwaukee Muslim community and a leader in interfaith dialogue and understanding. Ms. Janan Najib runs the Islamic Resource Center, a cultural center, and Islamic Lending Library. She founded the Milwaukee Muslim Film Festival, publishes the Wisconsin Muslim Journal, and directs Our Peaceful Home, the first culturally specific Muslim family strengthening and domestic violence program in Wisconsin. She is also the founder of the Wisconsin Muslim Civic Alliance, which aims to promote civic health and involvement. In 2016, she became the first Muslim in Wisconsin to open the floor of the state legislature with a prayer. Ms. Najib sits on many community committees, commissions, and boards, including Wisconsin Public Radio, the Marcus Center for the Performing Arts, and the Wisconsin Historical Society, and she will be covering Mary. Dr. Andrew Kim is the director of the Center of Advancement of the Humanities and Associate Professor of Theology at Marquette University. Having completed his PhD at Catholic University of America in 2013, Dr. Kim was the assistant professor at Walsh University prior to joining the Marquette faculty in 2017. His research and teaching focus on interdisciplinary, collaborative approaches to the theology of addiction and recovery. He has also written on virtue ethics and just war theory. His previous publications include the monograph, An Introduction to Catholic Ethics Since Vatican II, and his co-authored Just War Theory and Literary Studies, An Invitation to Dialogue. His essays have appeared in the Journal for Peace and Studies, New Blackfriars Studies in Christian Ethics, and the Journal of Moral Theology, among other venues. He will also be covering Mary. Rhonda Hill has spent over a decade focusing on issues of racism and poverty. She has served as a counselor, consultant, coach, and group facilitator. She is an analytical, creative systems thinker with compassion. Her commitment to raising awareness about racism is seen through her previous work with the Milwaukee Social Development Commission, the YMCA, the Greater Milwaukee Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, and as founder of Race and Faith. Rhonda founded Race and Faith in 2014 to deepen conversations on racism by making room for faith. Rhonda has a master's degree in marriage and family therapy and in theological studies. She will be covering Abraham. Sumir Ali has been serving as the Muslim chaplain at the campus in ministry, Marquette University, since 2019. His role includes providing emotional and spiritual support to students on campus and to staff. He's a board certified chaplain and also serves in the local hospice at hospitals in the Milwaukee area. Samir holds a master's in religious studies from Stanford and has been serving as an imam in the Shia Muslim community since 2014. Samir is fluent in Urdu, Hindi, Arabic, and Persian, and continues to advocate for increased interfaith bridge building and cross-cultural exchange. And he will also be covering Abraham. In our second round, all the guests will be covering Jesus from a Christian and Muslim perspective. And finally, we will take the audience's questions. Thank you for being with us tonight. And first up is Dr. Omar. Dr. Omar, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim and Pradeep. It's really an honor to be here with this distinguished panel. Before I talk about Hagar, if it's okay, I just wanted to say something about our topic today. So the topic of this program is, it starts with bridges or barriers, and I wanted to acknowledge where we received this framework of inquiry. So a recent book by a colleague, Professor Rita George Turkovich, called Christians, Muslims, and Mary, A History. She uses this sort of framework to compare Muslim and Christian views of Mary at different times and different places in history. So we thought that would be a good sort of a way to look at the other figures that we are considering in this program. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm grateful to our colleague, Rita. So Hagar, or as she is known to many Muslims, Siti Hajar, is an important spiritual figure in the Islamic tradition. By all accounts, she had a very difficult life. But despite her struggles, Hagar is remembered as someone whom God recognized as a formative person in faith. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So Hagar played a seminal role in the construction of what we know as the Islamic tradition. Hagar, of course, lived in a different time, much earlier than Prophet Muhammad, who is the founder of the Islamic tradition proper. But nevertheless, the connection, it will become clear if you read history and if you read prophetic traditions, the hadith, and so on. Focusing on Hagar and her story, let me just say, Hagar's story is a teaching story. It is told and remembered that way by Muslims everywhere. We learn that Hagar's struggles begin when she is, quote, cast out of the family of Abraham. And then he decides to bring her and her young son to the desert. Apparently, he was instructed to leave them there. The narrative from the hadith is very moving. And that's the crux of my sort of 7 minutes here today. So let me quote the hadith itself. And this is a translation made by Father Thomas Michel, a Jesuit scholar of Islam. In those days, there was nobody in Mecca, nor was there any water. So he, that is meaning Abraham, made them sit down and placed near them a leather bag with some dates and a small water skin containing water, and set out homeward. Ishmael's mother, that is Hagar, following him, said, Abraham, where are you going? Leaving us in this valley with nothing. She repeated that to him many times, but he did not look back at her. In other words, he kept walking. Then she asked him, has God ordered you to do this? And then Abraham turned around and said, yes. And then Hagar said, then God will not neglect us. This is from a authentic hadith found in the collection of hadith called the Bukhari. The story goes, as the water runs out and the young Ishmael was dying from thirst, Hagar began to think of a solution. So they're in a valley, and there's a hill on the one side and hill on the other side. And on the other side of these hills are the pathways or the highways where the caravans would be passing. So she decides to run up the hill and see if there is a caravan passing, so she can ask for water. Nobody there. So she comes down, goes on the other side, climbs up the other hill. And she does that several times, 7 times too, as the tradition says. And she finds nothing. And she herself is exhausted and is near death. Then the voice of Gabriel causes her to open her eyes. Now, Gabriel, as those of you know, in Islamic tradition, is also regarded as a medium through which divine human communication takes place, communication in air quotes. So the tradition notes that Gabriel strikes his foot, proverbial foot, in the vicinity of where they were. And as a result, the water gushes forth from the ground, and they are both saved. So what is the moral of the story? It is a teaching story, right? So this whole thing is called Hagar struggle, effort, Sa'i in Arabic, and is commemorated and remembered by every Muslim who goes to the pilgrimage on the Hajj. And so let's look at her question. When she learned that she questioned when Abraham was leaving her in the desert. She asked him that question, where are you going? You know, apparently referring to the seemingly inhuman action by Abraham. But when she learned that he was simply following God's command, God had told him to do so. Hagar then trusted in the higher wisdom and the divine providence. Now, what is interesting here is that while Abraham was obeying God, Hagar was acting out of her faith and trust in God. Her response says it all. Then God will not neglect us. And that's what the tradition says actually happened. God did not neglect her and her dying young infant. So my sort of purpose in rereading this story is to see how Hagar represents agency and personal action, and as opposed to how sometimes she's seen as passive and submissive to whatever is being done. She did not just pray for a miracle and remain sitting in one place. She acted. She ran back and forth from one hill to the other. So she animated her faith through action in the service of peace, and, very important, to protect, to preserve life, both her sons, but also her own. So Hagar's action, in my view, truly embody the tropes that are central to faith, really. Humility, as Pradeep said, piety, agency, and critique. Remember, her questioning Abraham wasn't just just simple question. It was a critique, right? Now, the problem as I see it, and within the framework of our topic of our evening, this program, the problem as I see it, that the story of Hagar has traditionally not received the prominence that it deserves. It is remembered in one way, but it can be remembered in many other ways. And that's what I think Father Thomas Michel does in his article on Hagar. What he does is he places Hagar in the center of the story without undermining the role that Abraham has played in history and in Islamic tradition and how he is remembered. So one reason is for this marginalization of Hagar's contribution and not recognizing her contribution to its fullest is that we are looking at patriarchal narrative structures that we have inherited. So to put it crudely, achievements by male actors are described in detail. Women do not appear to be present, or at least are located in the margins. And so that's my purpose to reread the stories, to see how we can address that. And here are some lingering questions. How can we ensure that these stories would continue to inspire inclusion and moral reasoning as we recall them and remember the figures and tropes depicted therein? How can we make these stories more relevant while remaining grounded in the primary sources of which they are a part? How can we read these stories today in order to reveal their soul, so to speak, instead of just reciting the narratives that we have inherited? And finally, how can we bring to light those structures of meaning that appear to be hidden in the margins because of how the story is told? So to conclude, to me, Hagar serves as a bridge between especially trust and obedience. And she, of course, serves as a bridge between Muslims and all others. She offers hope and discernment to know where one's real power lies and how to reclaim it. And she is a role model for the marginalized everywhere, including the refugees, Afghan refugees that we are currently hearing about, and also the migrants from Haiti that are on everybody's mind right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar. And thank you for starting with Hagar. I think it is important that we center and we speak about women and from the theological faith and their exercising of agency, because sometimes within the world that we live in, we can look at it and say, but she expected a reply, and the reply came, and that was her trusting. And sometimes we think about submission to the will, but that has to be deciphered from being submissive. And so, thank you so much. And Caitlin.
Thank you, Pardeep, and thank you, Dr. Omar. Yes, I think that's a great transition into what I am about to say at the start here. This is the first time I actually have kind of done a deep dive into Hagar's story and understanding the ways in which it has been looked at through different lenses throughout history. And I think depending on the lens that people take to look at it, we see different interpretations of the story, and ones that I think do challenge some of the status quo that we see in our society. So I'll start with kind of backing up a bit and looking at how Hagar's story is accounted in the book of Genesis in the Bible. It's around chapters 16 to 21. So just for some background, so Abraham was called by God to leave his country and his people to go to a new land where God promised to make Abraham and his descendants a great nation. And so Abraham and his wife, Sarah, were unable, though, to conceive a child. And so Sarah told Abraham to conceive a child with Hagar, who was Sarah's Egyptian slave. And once Hagar became pregnant, conflict and mistreatment arose between Hagar and Sarah. And so Hagar, who was pregnant at the time, fled into the desert. And that's where she encounters God, the angel of the Lord. And he speaks to her and he tells her to return to her mistress Sarah. He also tells her to name her son Ishmael, which means God hears, to signify God hearing her misery in the desert. And God also promises to increase the number of her descendants so that there'll be too many to count. And so Hagar at that time names God El Roi, which means the God who sees me. Then later in chapter 17, God promises Abraham a son with his wife Sarah, who's to be named Isaac, who he'll establish a covenant with, and who will also have a great nation. And he also promises to make Ishmael as well into a great nation. In chapter 21, Sarah becomes pregnant by God's promise and bore Abraham's second son, Isaac. And again, conflict between Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael rises again, and Hagar and Ishmael are cast out into the desert after Sarah and God both spoke to Abraham. And so when she was out in the desert this time, that's when her water runs out that she had been given by Abraham before she left. And she begins to cry at the thought of watching her son Ishmael die. And God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar and told her to not be afraid, that God has heard the boy cry, and he promises Hagar that he will make Ishmael again into a great nation. And he opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water and gives Ishmael a drink, and then they both survive. And Ishmael goes on to bear 12 sons and live many, many more years. And so for Christians, the story of Hagar presents several lessons that we can take, especially relevant to the oppressions happening in our neighborhoods today. So the first is God sees the oppressed and the cast out. There's a great YouTube video, actually. It's a sermon by Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, who is a Presbyterian minister, and she points out the significance of Hagar being the only person in the Bible to name God, and she names him El Roi, he who sees me. So Hagar is a homeless and degraded and dying woman. She is seen by God, and she names God for that. The other point is that God is present and has compassion for the oppressed and the cast out. So again, Reverend Dr. Lewis extends the commentary about how God again sees her and opens her eyes to the well, providing her and Ishmael with water. And God gives Hagar the same promise that Abraham had received, and that her son will lead a great nation. Additionally, having faith in God's promises is a key tenet here. Having the faith that after God commands Hagar to return to Sarah and Abraham, after running away, she does so in the faith that God will fulfill his promises. And then some others, and I'll end with the fact that, the theme that God's love has a wider reach, but beyond our own human understanding and our own human desires. So God's love for Ishmael cannot be controlled by Sarah. His promises were not just for Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, but also for Hagar and Ishmael as well. And so understanding that we do not control who God calls and who God loves, that his love and call is much broader than our own understanding. So like I said, there's so many interpretations of the story that I would love to go into, but just in the interest of time, I'll not dive deep, but just mention that this Hagar story has created dialogue around several social justice concerns, one of which being the patriarchal society, something that Dr. Omar had pointed to, as well as the issue or the conversation around surrogacy and motherhood, as well as American slave history, as well as oppression of the underclass. And there's also been comments of this, or interpretations and understandings of the story as it relates to the Israeli-Arab conflict. And it begs many questions for reflection, but I'd say some of the key ones that come to mind for me and that I've seen kind of in the literature have been, what does it mean to be an in-group member, an out-group member? How do we relate to those people, especially through our faith? And also the thoughts of, what could have come perhaps between Sarah and Hagar had relations between them been peacefully resolved and explored. So I'll end there, but I appreciate the opportunity to learn and continue discussing this as we go forth.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. The Hadiths and the Bible, and as they speak about the journey of Hagar and this sort of this abandonment felt by people in our society, and even as Ishmael is feeling that pain of his mother, this abandonment of children who are going through that, and how their dedication to the commitment of going forward and our dedication to the commitment going forward becomes one that the mission is not complete within the parental cycle, but our children can carry that on. So thank you so much for that reflection on Hagar. And next, Ms. Janan Najib will be covering Mary.
Thank you very much, Pardeep, and thank you, Professor Arfan and Caitlin, for that. Your comments on Hagar. I'm realizing that we could probably spend the entire session just talking about, one figure. And I just do have to say that regarding Hagar, that for Muslims, especially, she's such an important figure, and we feel there's such a lesson in it that God chose a woman who was a handmaiden, because slavery is not a divine institution. He chose an African woman, and he made her as really the symbol for Muslims of someone that really is dedicated to God. And this was part of God's plan, because eventually that's where the Kaaba, where they went, and where the water of Zamzam came, that's where the Kaaba was built. But anyhow, my presentation is actually on Mary. So, Mary is such an important figure for Muslims. Every believing Muslim is taught from a very young age to love and to honor and to emulate and revere Mary. We say alayha salam, so peace be upon her. We're also taught to love and revere her son, Jesus, again, alayhi salam, peace be upon him, and to believe in the miraculous conception and virgin birth. So as Muslims, although I've met Christians that don't believe in the virgin birth, Muslims are required to believe in the virgin birth. Mary or Maryam and Jesus or Isa are actually very common names in the Muslim community. It's rare to find a Muslim that is not elevated spiritually when they read the story of Maryam or Mary and that of her son Jesus in the Quran. In fact, any Muslim that does not believe in Mary and Prophet Jesus cannot consider themselves to be within the folds of Islam. The Holy Quran, which we believe to be the final revelation in the divine word of God, dedicates 2 entire chapters and numerous other verses to Mary and to Jesus. In fact, if you were to compare the Bible and the Quran regarding passages about Mary, you would find that there are far more references to Mary or Maryam within the Quran than there is even within the Bible. The 3rd chapter of the Quran, which is one of the longest chapters, is called Ali Imran, or basically the family of Imran. That is the family of Mary. It's also the 19th chapter is called Maryam or Mary. Interestingly, the Quran mentions many women by title or reference relating to their stories, like the wife of Noah, the wife of Lot, the wife of Pharaoh, the mother and sister of Moses. But Mary is the only woman in the Quran that is actually mentioned by name. In fact, she's mentioned by name 34 times. And 2 times she's mentioned as the one who guarded her chastity, or al-Batul. So significant is her position in Islam that there are many Muslim scholars, in fact, that believe she was actually a prophet. So much for the notion of only men being prophets. Because in the Islamic concept of prophethood, the individuals that come closest to being perfect human beings are those who are the prophets. Muslims believe that Mary and Jesus and all of the prophets that were chosen by God were actually Muslim. Now, when I refer to Muslim here, because this obviously predates Prophet Muhammad, this is Muslim with a lowercase, in the sense that Muslim as one who submits totally to the will of God and submits their total life to the will of God. And that is definitely who Mary was. Muslims differ with the biblical understanding of Mary because we don't believe that Mary is the mother of God. We believe she's really a great human being, possibly a prophet, a vehicle for God's plan and God's commitment to send guidance to mankind. And as Muslims, we believe that all humans are born pure, because we don't believe in the concept of original sin. And so what takes place later, of course, in the life of Mary and Jesus within the Christian perspective is not found within the Muslim perspective, because we don't have the concept of original sin. As Muslims, we reject the literal sonhood of Jesus to God, but we believe in metaphorically saying that we're all children of God. We don't believe that Mary or Jesus share divinity with God. It's our belief as Muslims that God is beyond biological characterizations. So for Muslims, our knowledge of Mary comes from two sources, the Quran and the Hadith, or the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, it's clear that Mary's great spirituality and her spiritual achievement and faith even preceded the miraculous conception of Jesus. So when you read about her within the Quran, she is her own person. She is a personality. She is well known. She is guided before she even has Jesus. So she's revered not just simply for being the mother of a great prophet, but because she herself was a spiritual luminary in her own right, through divine guidance, spiritual exercise, and the awareness of blessings which drew her closer to God and in her total submission to God. Another observation about Mary is her total acceptance of her role as a mother, because it was God's will. Imagine, scholars estimate, and this is including Christian scholars, that Mary was only between the age of 10 to 15 when she underwent the miraculous conception. So in these days, she would be an underage child pretty much. Yet she cared for this child in infancy and encouraged him to face life with steadfast faith. She is a lesson for all parents. The Quran states that God made Mary and Jesus a sign for all people. Hence, the two, mother and child, are bound together as one in their representation of being the best of human virtues, among which is the reciprocation of concern and affection, which God has decreed between parent and child. The love that you find Jesus has for his mother, as outlined in the Quran and in the Hadith, is just a superb example. And the love, of course, of mother to child and her sacrifice is again a superb example. In Islam, Mary's chastity is unquestioned. It's a model for believing men and women. Devout Muslim women throughout history try to emulate her in her commitment to God, her morality, and her modesty, and her dress of modesty. So she's not only a spiritual example for us, but also a physical one. So practicing Muslim women follow the standards of modesty that Mary, the mother of Jesus, followed. So I was trying to keep my remarks as concise as possible. I apologize if I went over, but I will be open for Q&A later. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Janann. And yeah, thank you for just, Mary as the ultimate symbol of motherhood and piety. And, the more than half of the world's population understands that to be true. So as women go through some of the sort of the trials and tribulations of motherhood, she becomes the symbol of just prayer and centeredness and ultimately of that same piety and the belief in that will. So thank you so much. And Dr. Andrew Kim.
Thanks so much, Pardeep, and thank you to everyone who's spoken before me here, to Irfan and to Caitlin and to Janann. I appreciate so much this opportunity to learn from all of you and to discuss these figures that are vital to our respective traditions. When I started thinking about the presentation for this evening and talking about the Virgin Mary from a Christian perspective, I realized that I immediately encounter a problem, and one of the problems that I think the title of our talk gets at, which is that Mary has been the source of much division throughout Christian history and was during the Reformation. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the Marian doctrines from a Catholic point of view, but I'd like to approach those through the writings of Pope Francis, and in particular, Evangelii Gaudium, because I think that can help give us a way of thinking about doctrines in general and the doctrines of Mary in particular in a way that operates as a bridge. And so I want to focus on three themes throughout that, which are the theme of belonging and the idea that Pope Francis, as well as Pope Benedict before him and St. John Paul II, frequently referenced that with Mary, the church has a mother, and that we all have a mother and a sense of belonging. And then the second theme is that of accompaniment, which is a major theme in the writings of Pope Francis and in Evangelii Gaudium, and that goes along with the theme of liberation theology, which I think is relevant in the Magnificat, which I'll end by sharing with everybody. So to start with, then, in terms of the doctrines, in the Catholic tradition, Mary is believed to have been immaculately conceived, and so oftentimes this is confused with the virgin birth. I find when we teach this with undergraduates that are conflated into the same doctrine, but this is the belief that Mary was conceived without the stain of original sin. And one way of thinking about that doctrine, then accompanying doctrines of the Assumption, or sometimes in the patristic tradition called the Dormition of Mary, is that Mary is called to a profound purpose within the divine plan, but that this is all made possible through her active fiat and through her willing to participate in this way. And Mary is often regarded as accompanying the church throughout the generations. And so that gets to kind of the distinction I wanted to make that Pope Francis talks about, which is that Francis talks about doctrine. And at the beginning of Evangelii Gaudium, he says that there's two mistakes that you can make in terms of how you approach doctrine. And the first mistake he calls rigidity, which means a kind of cold, objectified approach to doctrine, that the emphasis is on certainty and the emphasis is on kind of demarcating who's in and who's out in terms of the belief system. And on the opposite side of that, he talks about what he calls displacement, which is an attempt to bring the doctrines into conversation in a way that somehow empties them of that which is in the continuity of the tradition, so as to become displaced from the tradition. And in between those two things, he places what he calls flexibility. And flexibility entails a lot of things, but one thing it entails is approaching each doctrine from the standpoint of the love of the resurrected Christ and what he calls encounter. And so what I wanted to get at through that paradigm was what it would mean to encounter Mary as opposed to encountering doctrines about Mary, which is not to say that those two things are mutually exclusive, but I don't know that one necessarily entails the other, or the former necessarily entails the latter. And so in thinking about Mary that way, I would turn to the Chalcedonian controversy in the early church, in which there's what seemed to be a doctrinal debate about the status of Mary, in which the Bishop Nestorius objected to the idea that Mary is the Theotokos, or mother of God, and said rather that Mary is the Christotokos, the mother of Christ. And so this debate had to do with the other debates about the Christological controversies and debates about the divine and human natures of Christ. So it ended up being resolved that Mary's the Theotokos at the council. But the point I want to focus on is not the way that those debates took shape or all of the theology that was embedded in them, but rather the fact that the Theotokos term emerged not from a bishop, but from those who were praying, those who were worshiping. It emerged in the liturgy, and Nestorius overheard it. And that's when it moved to the second level, or this other level of analysis. And so what that speaks to me to, as well as the tradition of apparitions and Virgin of Guadalupe and so many others that we could talk about here if we had more time, is the experience that throughout the centuries, people in different cultures and different times have had of the Virgin Mary being on their side and being there for them over and against whatever obstacles they were facing. And as Janan mentioned earlier, the struggles that Mary faced early in life and the overwhelming odds that she seemed to be facing. And so I think what all of that speaks to is that in a world in which people can often feel excluded and marginalized, Mary has been and continues to be a source of feeling of belonging and of purpose and of dignity, and has given people a sense that they're being accompanied, and has modeled how to accompany those that are suffering, primarily through identification with the marginalized. So I think if there's one main thing to take away from the Christian story about Mary, it's that Mary brings to those who are suffering the feeling of being divinely loved. And she shares that with them in a way that encourages solidarity and is empowering. I think that the best way to articulate that truth is not in anything I've prepared here, but in the Magnificat of Scripture in Luke chapter 1, 46 through 55. And so I'll end with that. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever." So with that, I'll hand it back to Pardeep.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. And I was fortunate to join Dr. Kim for a couple of his classes today on addiction. And I think we talked a little bit about, without talking about, the sense of belonging that Mary really embodied for so many people, and that sense of hope. So thank you so much. And Rhonda is going to cover Abraham. Rhonda.
Hi. Well, I was gonna let Samir go first so I can just say ditto, but yes. I just want to first say to everybody, thank you so much for your thoughtful sharing and the way you've illuminated your figure. It's been very helpful and insightful and just promising and encouraging. So I'm hoping those of you who are watching this, that it inspires you to kind of go back and look up these figures for yourself and come to your own thoughts and conclusions about them, especially if you are a Christian or a Muslim, or even perhaps someone who practices Judaism, and see what you come up with, what things. I love the Hagar Mary. We could have just did a whole thing with that. So I picked Abraham because Mary was taken and I was too slow. And then I picked Abraham and I said, oh my gosh, what did I do? Because Abraham is a huge figure. So the bridge and the barrier question, that's interesting to me. And thinking about Abraham, it's hard. It was hard for me to imagine the barriers. So especially so much, and maybe it's just my own Christian blindness that kept me from being able to see the barrier. So I look forward to hearing other thoughts when Samir shares his. But in Christianity, Abraham is the bridge for us. Along, like, he's the bridge to Jesus, which for us as Christians, Jesus is a central figure, a figure of salvation for us. And so Jesus comes from the seed of Abraham, which represents so much promise. And so one way I think I want to try to present Abraham in a way that hopefully can resonate with those who are watching, who may not subscribe to either religion, but so hopefully this can make sense. So Abraham, as I see him and what he's brought to the Christian faith, is one, first, the theme of faith is central. He has what I wrote down as just this radical yes, this radical yes to God. So he was able to, when God asked him to move up and pick up and leave from his family, and what he knew, he said yes. When God asked him to sacrifice his son, well, as we already heard, he sacrificed his son Ishmael. That was one son, and then he again was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. So he continuously says yes to God, to some things that I think is pretty doggone radical. And so that's one way we get to see him, is this radical yes to God, this radical willingness just to be obedient to what he perceived is God's will for his life at the moment in time, which in some ways that can be inspiring to people, but for other folks, they might be like, man, that's crazy. I don't think I have a radical yes in me. I'm not following anybody like that. And I think the other part, which I think for me, especially, I grew up Christian, Pentecostal, in the Black church tradition. And later on in my life, I started working with the Lutheran church, and particularly the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is much more liberal than even the way I grew up. And some really interesting things happened there, which match with the way that I was raised in my very Black Pentecostal church to going over to like a super lily white church, was this idea of the saved by grace, that who we are and what we have is all because we're justified through God's grace. So it's this idea that no matter what, you can't perform enough works to make you right or perfect in the sight of God. It's just because of the grace and the love of God that you are accepted. And so that's what we get into this conversation about law and gospel. And that starts right here with Abraham. So Abraham entered into this covenantal relationship with God, this deal with God. And this deal was not because of how we understand it. It wasn't so much because Abraham did everything right, but it's because God is God, and God did everything right and just said, hey, I'm gonna pick you, I'm gonna make this deal with you, and I'm gonna promise you that, one, you're gonna have a child, and from this seed, the rest of the world will continuously be blessed. And we see that continual blessing come in the form of Jesus, through Jesus being born, and the idea that we're saved. Some people think saved through the sacrifice of Jesus's life. And so the idea of justification of who you are, purely based off God's yes to you, not solely fixed, even though we get fixed sometime on Abraham's yes to God, but it's really about God's radical yes to you, and God making this relationship, this deal with you, that you will have this promise, the eventual promise of his love and his assurance to always be with you. And that's what I loved about that story when you shared about Hagar, and her picking up on that God's radical yes to her. I just think that's so powerful. I don't want to start preaching because I could start trying to come up with a sermon. But so as I'm sharing and as you're hearing what I'm saying about Abraham and how I connect to him in my Christian faith, it is in this, we use fancy words, we can say justification by faith, or but it's really this idea that God gives a radical yes to us. And we get to see that first through Abraham and the way God called and picked him to be the one, be the person that will get this blessings of abundance of his seed being blessed for generations to come. We don't know why God picked him. And that's the beautiful thing about it. None of us really knows why God picks us, but God does. God picks us and gives us this sustaining promise that no matter what, I'm with you, and you have my love forever. And so that's what I think about. If I could just be in the most simplest terms in my life and faith and why Abraham has meaning for me, it is that it's God's radical yes to him. And I know sometimes we think about the way he, made certain sacrifices, but it's really looking at that deal, or that covenantal relationship between God and man that we see play out between God and Abraham. That is, for me especially, and I think so many of us, especially growing up in the Black church tradition, and your faith is really all that you're having in the midst of so many oppressive situations, to get this idea or thought that no matter where I am, God sees me, and God has just made this radical deal with me to say yes to me, no matter what. And so I'm hoping that as you hear us and hear these stories about Hagar, Mary, and eventually we'll talk about Jesus, I'm hoping you hear that God's radical yes. And so that's my moment. That's what I got.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. And yes, I think just to echo what you just said, as far as, yes, Abraham's radical yeses to God all of the time, right? But then a lot of times we may not hear that radical yes to us, or maybe too much of a burden to actually hear that, or whatever, for whatever reasons, or wherever we are. Sometimes it's pain, sometimes other things cause us to not hear that, but to walk in that grace and know that God is always saying yes to us. Thank you so much. Samir?
Rhonda, I'm just going to say ditto to whatever you said. Thank you so much. But thank you, everyone, for sharing your such precious thoughts about these important figures. There's so much to delve into, and I hope this is the start of a continued conversation about Mary and Hagar and Abraham and such figures which we share between our faiths. When I was preparing to talk about Abraham, I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, because as a chaplain, my role is to be present with those, especially those in hospice, who are dying, those who are going from this world. And I come to meet them in the last few months of their life. So I sit with them, I journey with them, I'm present with them. And I found in the past 5, 6, 7 years of doing this, that faith is an element of human existence. Faith is an element in the human soul and the human mind that needs a lot of time and space to digest and to express itself. Everything else can be done kind of quickly, right? You can make a meal, food, clothing, go about your day, but faith really needs, it requires more attention than our everyday activities. So I talk to people who are in their last few months of life. They know they're going. Some of them are accepted, some of them are angry. They have different kind of emotional expressions. I sit with them. And then when it comes to faith, we talk about figures. So they talk about their own faith in God. As a Muslim chaplain, the majority of my patients are not Muslim. and I've served in different places in rural Wisconsin. But the fact is that when we have these conversations, some of the conversations I've had were about Mary. One patient I'm not going to forget was a very devout Catholic who talked about her visions of Mary. And I talked to her about, she wanted to know about what Mary meant to me as a Muslim and as a Shia Muslim. So I talked about that. And we had some very weekly, hour-long conversations. And then she eventually passed away, and I was honored to be called by the family to share a few words at her memorial service or at her celebration of life. So I think that to come back to our theme about bridges or barriers, I will say that it's very important, the gaps that everyone has filled in. There are gaps in our understanding of each other's religion. There are gaps in understanding of what Jesus means, or Mary means, or Abraham means to Muslims and to Christians in different ways. But the end result, I feel, should be a practical presence, a practical honoring of what our fellow human being from another faith believes in, and how those historical understandings, theological understandings, spiritual experiences, beliefs can be bridges to kind of journey and accompany each other as we celebrate different things, as we go through different events, and to be present with each other. So Abraham certainly is very important, right? So one of them is his significance. And I found this in Genesis and in Islam. In Genesis, as in God is telling Abraham, no longer you will be called Abraham, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. And we have in Hadith traditions in Islam that his name comes from two words, bir wa ham, which means virtue. He's got virtue, a man of virtue and piety, a man remembering God, and ham, which means in this context, someone who is distressed with the world, someone who is constantly aware that his final destination is going to be with God, and the world is only a temporary place for him to inhabit and to continue to do good works, which is the first part of his name. So Abraham being a symbol of I'm going to say, to articulate a role model, an example for us as Christians and Muslims to look at Abraham, to look at his life, to look at his faith, to look at how he was tested, and to walk with each other as we practically inhabit and try to express this faith in our belief. The second thing is in the life of Abraham, we see is the land, right? There's all these sacred markers. So in Genesis, again, when God is ordering Abraham to leave his land in Babylonia or Iraq today, and then he goes westward, he goes to what is now the Holy Land, Jerusalem and such, and God gives him this land to him and his children, right? At the same time, Abraham in Islam is raising the foundation of the Kaaba, of the holy mosque, and then with his son, he's raising that and praying, "Oh God, accept this from us. Surely you are the one who hears and knows," in chapter number 2. So sacred land and sacred space, besides being an example, is another way that Abraham is here. And that's a bridge of understanding that this sacred land that God has given to us through Abraham in Islam and in Christianity and in Judaism is a shared space for us to inhabit, to talk about the rights of all human beings, to talk about the rights of Israelis, Palestinians, Muslims, Jews, to have access to the land and to honor and to respect each other instead of going the other way and being very selfish, because religion can also make you very expressive of your selfishness and discriminate against others. So we have to kind of stop that, I feel, looking at the example of Abraham. And the last thing I would say is the progeny of Abraham, right? In the Bible, in again Genesis, God is saying, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and you and all the families of earth shall be blessed." So you will be blessed in all the families of the earth. Again, in the Quran, the similar thing is repeated, that God gave Abraham and the progeny of Abraham wisdom, and he gave them the book, which is scripture, and he honored them. So coming to Islam, of course, the progeny of the family of the Prophet Muhammad is honored and venerated, especially in my denomination in Shia Islam. The wallpaper that you see, Dinan and I were talking about at the beginning, is of a city called Karbala. And right now, in these days, actually, this weekend is the day of Arba'in, where it is one of the largest religious pilgrimages in the world. 20 million, 30 million people, Muslims, non-Muslims, go and visit this shrine, which is located in Iraq. We have Christians and Hindus coming to visit and show their respect for Hussein, who is a descendant of Prophet Muhammad in Islam, right? And he was martyred, he's remembered. But there are a lot of parallels with Abraham and the sacrifice that Ibrahim made, as this is kind of a renewal of his message and his spirit. And really, it's become a way of walking with each other and honoring each other as followers of different faiths, but finding common ground in really the themes that we find in our theology and in our faith. So I hope that these bridges will be continue to be built intentionally and not accidentally. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Samir, and and we thank you for the work that you do, walking people and transitioning and serving as that bridge. We are going to go into the next sort of round and talk about Jesus. And as we ask this question about Jesus, we'll kind of go in order back to Dr. Omar and just kind of ask Jesus, did Jesus serve as a bridge, a barrier, both? Dr. Omar? And we'll answer questions. We'll take questions in just a little bit.
Thank you. This was so inspirational to hear everybody here. Now, we are giving less time to talk about Jesus, even though, as I think all of us know, Jesus takes the cake when it comes to popularity in among all the people that we're discussing. So Hagar has been talked about the least, both in terms of literature, scholarly literature, but also how she figures in the central sort of activities in faith traditions. And Mary has been, of course, received a great deal of attention, and Jesus is surpasses in terms of the discussion on top of it. So let me just say one thing about Christ. So many Muslim scholars have spoken about Christ in the Quran and how Christ is seen in Christianity. And there are two things that they believe are not bridgeable: the divinity of Christ and the question of the Trinity. But there is a third question about whether Jesus died on the cross, and there is some discussion among Muslim scholars about that. Especially over the question of are we talking about literal death? Are we talking about the death of Christ, the Word, the Kalima, or are we talking about death of Christ, the man? And so I'll leave it there. And these are big questions. They will require a program, separate program, probably longer than 3 hours. And so we'll come back to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Omar. I would say in terms of barriers, I think there are plenty when it comes to Jesus. I know even within the Christian tradition, that there's many interpretations and across religions as well. So I'll just state, though, from a Lutheran perspective, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, it's because of our recognition of Jesus, or as the Trinity, so God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's because of that duality of having Jesus both human and divine that fuels our call to interfaith work. So I'll share a couple excerpts from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, their policy statement on the Declaration of Interfaith Commitment, because I think it highlights the way in which Jesus calls us to serve as he had served. And so I'll read straight from there because I think they describe it better than I could. So we believe that Christ, our peace, has put an end to the hostility of race, ethnicity, gender, and economic class. In a deeply divided world, and as a faithful response to Christ's message of reconciliation, we seek right, peaceful, and just relationships with all of our neighbors, including those of other religions and worldviews. We do this as an expression of our Christian faith and as a continuation of the covenant God made with us in holy baptism, to serve all people, following the example of Jesus, and to strive for justice and peace in all the earth. And I'll continue in highlighting some of the passages they go on to say about specifically for the Lutheran faith, understanding the unique view as Jesus, who, again, unique and divine, suffers on the cross for us. I quote the passage: "At the heart of Luther's theology of the cross is a unique view of God present in the person of the crucified Jesus. Jesus' suffering on the cross was a redemptive suffering for the sake of all. The Jesus who endured the cross is also present with us, all humans, the whole creation, in times of suffering. This understanding of a theology of the cross causes us to take the reality of suffering seriously. As Christian disciples, we are called to take up the cross, acting on behalf of others who seek ways to end the suffering of others, even though doing so may lead us to suffer with them. This is part of our vocation as Christians, and when ending suffering is not possible, we are still called to accompany, to be with those who suffer, just as Christ and God came to be with us." So just a unique perspective, I think, on that, how yes, well, differences may exist, regarding how Jesus is portrayed and conceived as somebody who's both divine and human or not. I think it's important to note that the way that Lutherans view that humanity that Christ has does fuel our relationship with interfaith, which then brings us here to conversations where we can learn and grow deeper in our understanding and the mystery of what we need to continue to grow into and discover. And as Samir had said, it's an everyday, a long digestion process when it comes to faith.
I think I'm next. And I, again, similar to, I think, what was mentioned before, Jesus, peace be upon him, yes, is both a bridge and also a barrier. Definitely a bridge if we talk about who Jesus was. Even Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, considered Jesus to be closest to him in terms of, as if they are brothers in just their nature and their missions. And Jesus is, a very beloved figure in Islam as far as his kindness, as far as his love and the purpose of what he came to bring people back to faith, to bring them back to the children of Israel, to bring them back to their faith. But having said that, there is definitely a difference in the nature from the Muslim perspective and Christian perspective as the nature of Jesus, because as I had mentioned before, the concept of divinity for any human being, Muslims don't believe that Prophet Muhammad shared divinity with God, Abraham, Adam, anyone shares divinity with God, that all are human beings and God is one. And the concept also of original sin, that something that happened, is carried through generations, is something that does not exist in Islam. And so the concept of, baptism, these types of things don't exist for Muslims because we don't believe in original sin. And the concept of blood sacrifice, the idea that God can just say, I forgive, without blood sacrifice. And so there are very significant aspects that are definitely different in the understanding. But at the end of the day, there is within the Quran itself a very important verse that says to the people of faith, it says, "Come, people, particularly this is in reference to the monotheistic faiths, that come because, to a common word that we share together. And that common word at the end of the day is God. God is the one that determines, our understanding of what the nature of God is. But our responsibility is to work together for the love of God and to work to make this world a better place. People within the same family may disagree about different perspectives on different things, but what's important is that our faith in what we believe in, if it is not motivating us to do good for the world, then we need to check our faith. And I think that whether we're Muslims or Christians or whatever, that's something that we share together.
Yeah, that's a great place to pick up. Thank you for that. I'll try to go real quickly here because I know I want to make sure we get to the questions. I think that in terms of what the potential barriers are doctrinally, those have kind of already been named. So I just want to expand maybe a little bit on the bridges that, for Christians, Christ is our Savior, and returning to the theme that Rhonda mentioned earlier, and maybe trying to connect that with what I was saying about the Virgin Mary, about belonging and accompaniment. On an experiential level, I think that one of the things that Christian beliefs about Christ and then interrelatedly salvation speaks most highly to is the view of salvation as something that's freely given and that we accept and that we don't earn, and that we kind of live up to after it's given, and that the relationship is the basis for what follows, as opposed to a sort of prize that we win by demonstrating a certain amount of moral character or devotion, or what have you. And so I think that one of the things on an experiential level that is a bridge in terms of the experience of Christ. And this goes back to some of the things we were talking about in class today when Pardeep was so gracious to speak to my classes, that people have a very, very deep need for belonging and for feeling like they're significant, like they matter, for being freed from their shame, for feeling like their lives are important, for feeling like they need to be renewed and restored. And so I think that an area in Christian doctrine, I guess it would technically be called pastoral, but I think it's doctrinal as well, is the extent to which we find that healing and that experience through our relationship with Christ, but then equally importantly, the way we extend that very same mercy to those we encounter that maybe are struggling or suffering or feeling alienated, in the ways that we extend that compassion to our neighbor. So if that kind of a love and community is not a bridge, then I don't know what is.
Ditto. I think overall, Jesus, while me being a Christian, for me, Jesus is the ultimate bridge. But Jesus, as the huge figure, I think, as Dr. Omar started off saying, Jesus is a widely known figure. I think Jesus comes with a lot of controversy and a lot of barriers, even within Christianity, because it's some who take him as truly being like the divine. He's God in the flesh, God who came and dwelt among us through his physical form of Jesus. There's some who believe that, and some people who don't, So it is that question of Jesus's divinity, Jesus being the only way. That's been a huge central theme through Christianity, and especially what we see played out in our country today, especially when we start talking about Christian nationalism and how many especially like white supremacists, don't want any other kind of religious views out there. It's because this idea, Jesus is the only way, and you only get to know God through Jesus. And so we have to get rid of all other kinds of religious thoughts and thinking. And so I think it wouldn't be fair of us to not mention those things if we're having a conversation about bridges and barriers, as these are the obvious things that come up when you mention Jesus, which can make Jesus such a controversial figure, as much as Jesus is a beloved figure for me, and has been for me such a light and a love and example. I know for other people it can be very bring a lot of fear, and it bring a lot of shame, a lot of question, like maybe I don't belong or maybe I don't fit because I don't see Jesus in the same way that other folks in this predominantly Christian country see Jesus. And so with everything else that's been shared by both, I think Andrew and both Caitlin represent Christianity. I totally agree. I totally agree with what you shared and what you put out there, but I also know that we do have to, and oftentimes the minority, sometimes the three of us, in terms of what is put out there by and large for other people to consume and think about Christianity. The fact that we want to come and play well in the sandbox, if you will, with other folks with other ideologies and ideas. And I'm on a whole spiritual high listening to all of these different ideas and verses, but it's some people who will just think that this is some Christians who will say it's Jesus alone, Jesus and nothing else. And that's the barrier, I think, for us as Christians, those of us who are saying, no, Jesus can be a real bridge, and Jesus is a real bridge. And we don't have to just put that flag on the ground or make that line in the sand and say no other thing can be heard or tolerated. So I think it's really important for us as we have this conversation today, especially about barriers, to say to other Christians, hey, we live in a country that's very diverse. It's not only diverse racially, but it's diverse religiously. And we have to make room for that. We don't have to agree with everything what people have to say or how they think about it, how they view it, but we're all here. And I think the one thing we can't sit under is that we are, if you follow Christian doctrine at all, we're all God's children. And so we have to figure out, how does that relate to how we deal to each other on a day-to-day basis? As Janan beautifully already stated, the differences between Islam's view of Jesus and Christianity and original sin and Mary and divinity. That is fine. So let us find ways to be at peace with people who don't see things the same way we see them. Her ideas about divinity does not change mine. I believe in the divine presence of Jesus and Mary and those things. That's fine. I'm gonna love her and hug her and keep going and keep getting this wisdom from her. If you've listened, she's dropped some real nuggets. The last session we were together and this one. I'm gonna continue to think about what Dr. Omar lifted up about Hagar and what that means for us. So I want to just encourage Christians watching this today, allow, as if you follow scripture well, when Paul had the scales on his eyes, those things fell off so he could really see the truth. Let those scales fall from your eyes. Don't make barriers that don't have to be there. Let's find the ways to be more bridges. So that's my piece.
Right. And lastly, I mean, all of you have shared, and I think the figure of Jesus is so much to look at, and there's bridges and there's barriers. But I want to talk about one icon of Jesus related worship that stands out for me. If you look at the church, I drive by here in Ozaki County, there's a church and there's a bell. And every time I go, drive past it with my 5-year-old, she asks about that plus sign and the bell. And that bell, which is associated with the church, which I'm assuming came on later, has a certain significance in one of the hadiths that we find in Islam. What is that bell that the Christians ring to remind themselves, or as a symbol of the presence of Jesus in their lives? What is that bell signifying to me as a Muslim, because we have one tradition, one hadith from Ali, who was the son-in-law and the successor of Prophet Muhammad. He said that this bell, he was walking as a Muslim in a world that had Christians in it, in the Hijaz, where Islam came. And he said, do you know, to his companion Hadith, he said, do you know what this bell is saying? Do you know what the bell of the church is saying when the Christians are ringing this bell? And his companion said, please tell me. He said, the bell is constantly calling out that there is no God but God, truly. And then the bell says, surely this world has beguiled us. This world has occupied us. This world has made itself attractive to us. O son of this world, O children of this world, O people, take your time, gather together. The world is being annihilated moment by moment. No day passes us without a pillar of this world falling. We have ruined our concept of the everlasting life, which is the next world, and we have made our homes in this world of transition. And we will not know how much we lost until we pass. So the bell is giving us a wake-up call. The bell is literally, that's exactly what it is, about what we are doing in this world and how we have to be answerable before God into how many bridges we have built and how much we have tried to represent our faith to others in a good way, have accepted them where they are, and have tried to find this common word and the common ground that the Quran is constantly calling us towards. So that in the image of that bell is something I think is a bridge between us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Samir. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Dr. Omar, Caitlin, Janan, Dr. Kim. And as I and I know that I can't give a sick perspective of Jesus, it's probably not be allowed, but I do feel, when we think about controversy and we think about this topic that we have here, bridges and barriers, and we think about the commitment to even have these discussions and embrace the controversy. And I think that when we talk about the future and future generations, we owe it to them. We owe it to them to repair some of this, to make sure that we are taking on these conversations and whatever that controversy looks like. So Jesus was not, and within all of our faiths, we have prolific leaders, prophets, angels, people, that guides, gurus, that were controversial figures. They were not just about, hey, you just let me get along to get along, just go along to get along. They were controversial. Jesus was controversial. Jesus came to give voice to the poor, the suffering, the people who didn't feel like they had voice. Many of the people that we discussed today followed that will because that will was guided by that same voice of betterment. And I thank you all for the work that you all do collectively in your respective, like in our respective communities and interfaith work. And, just to thank you for having this conversation today. We're going to go over to Jorge, and he has some questions from the audience. Go ahead, Jorge.
Yeah, so we have a comment by Willie Perry. He says, great depiction of Our Lady Mary. Well done, Najib. And we have one question, which I think we can open to the whole panel. And the question is by Megan Heater. She says, God's grace operating in the figures' lives you have discussed has been a fascinating thread to follow. Are there central similarities and differences in how Christianity and Islam understand grace? Similarities and differences in the ways Christianity and Islam understand grace. So I think we can open it to the panel. So if you can just, we can maybe follow the same sort of lineup and just give us your perspective.
Yeah, let me just say, just briefly. So the word grace, I understand it in Islamic tradition, there are several words in the Quran that speak to that notion. Compassion, mercy, friend, as these are all seen as names and attributes of God. And a Muslim's practicing Muslim would always begin with invoking these names. So in other words, the grace or the compassion of God is overarching. It's abundant, despite the fact that you also have some ideas of God as a judge. But Muslims invoke God in every day, in every minute, with the names of God that speak to the same notion as grace in Christianity.
Yeah, in terms of, my Christian perspective growing up, I always understood that we received grace freely from God and his salvation, and that we always were called to extend that grace onto others. And so for me, I've really taken that emphasis on how we extend that grace to our neighbors, also as a free gift. And that's something that, again, deepens relationships with other people and allows for compassion and acceptance and learning and growing together.
Grace is a very important concept in Islam, and the concept of God's grace being ever present is very clear. The air we breathe, the food we eat, even those that reject him and don't believe in God, God's grace is there. He doesn't stop feeding them. He doesn't stop providing air and water and etc. for them. So that's also a lesson for us, that it's not for us to judge just simply because the people believe in him, don't believe in him, but it is incumbent on the believer to recognize God's grace and to be worthy of that grace. So even though God's grace is present, we also should be worthy of that grace. And there's a special there's even a hadith, a tradition of the prophet, where the prophet is always praying and worshiping God, etc. And I think it was maybe his wife or one of the companions asked, well, why are you were basically promised, you're saved, you're basically promised heaven. And he said, shouldn't I be a grateful servant? And so although grace is there, we are supposed to really be worthy of that.
I don't know that I have very much to add to what Janan just said. I think of it in very much the same way. I guess the way, and to summarize it very quickly, is that it's sometimes you find the view, either in terms of what one holds or what they're enacting, that they need to earn relationship with God or earn divine acceptance, and they have to kind of climb a high mountain of virtue and able to be worthy of relationship with God. And the way that I understand grace, and I believe this overlaps in Catholic and Protestant traditions, is that grace is the idea that the relationship comes first, and then we become worthy of it through the relationship. So the relationship itself is the ground through which worthiness is attained. It's not that we have to kind of pass some bar and then God will love us. So that's how I understand grace. Another way I understand it is just divine help. We need help, and help that we didn't earn, but it's freely given from a God who is love, as it says in 1 John 4:8.
Yeah, in agreement with everything that's already been shared. So I'll just pass to Samir.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult concept or complicated concept, but grace, salvation is earned in Islam. And for me personally, salvation is something that you earn, that God gives you because of your faith and your good actions that you do. But grace is something that God gives you freely, and God gives to everybody. And he gives above and beyond what you deserve. So that for me would be where the word fadl in the Quran, or fadl in belief, would be what that is, the grace of God that we all expect in this world and in the next world.
Thank you. I have a question myself, and it goes on the, I guess, opposite side of grace. And it's a question of virtue. As you were talking, it seemed to me that all these figures, Hagar, Abraham, Mary, and Jesus, in a sense, we take them as as figures of virtue, right? And one of the things that it seemed to me that you all emphasized was that their virtue consisted in sort of taking the side of the marginalized, right? So I was thinking, my question is, how do Christianity and Islamic traditions think about virtue in relation, say, between Mary and the relation to God, right? But also, when we consider these figures as role models in our relations to others, right? So what is the role of virtue between these figures and God and our relations to others? Thank you. I would just like to open it to everybody or whoever wants to take the question.
I think we should reverse the order and Samir should go first. Because it's a difficult question, that's why I'm saying it.
I'm still trying to think about what that would mean. Could you, Jorge, could you say it?
Right. So I was thinking, right. So if we think about grace in terms of, it's not something that I can work for, right? It's something that is given to me by God. So the opposite side of the question is the question of virtue, right? And so even though Abraham, right, probably there was nothing he could do to deserve God's grace, right? We also look at Abraham as a figure of virtue, as a virtuous figure, right? In such a way that we should imitate, right? Abraham's he's taking the side of the poor, he's taking the side of the marginalized, or like Rhonda said, his radical jest to God, right? So even though, right, the virtue is on the opposite side of grace, when we look at these figures, we look at them as role models, right? As something we should imitate in our behavior towards others, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a verse in the Quran in chapter 3, verse 67, that God says to introduce Abraham to the Muslims in the Quran. He uses exactly that kind of thinking. God says Abraham was not a Jew and Abraham was not a Christian. And then you would expect God to say Abraham was a Muslim, but God doesn't say that right away. God says he was not Jewish or Christian, so don't identify him with your tribal or theological identities. Rather, he was a Hanif, a upright person, a person who was very upright, inclining toward truth, virtuous person who, first off, obeyed God and followed his commandments. That's one. Who did good for others, who created good in this world. All those things that I think are very important for us, especially in an interfaith setting here in Milwaukee in 2021. So he embodies all those things. And then God says, after introducing his virtues and his characteristics, and then God, ends that verse in the Quran with saying, yes, he was one who submitted to God, and he was one who did not associate any partners with God. So his theology was pure, but before his theology, his practical, expression of where he was very admirable for everybody. So I think that verse in the Quran really talks about some of the things that virtues that you were asking about.
Thank you.
If I can just jump in, just one thought too, the concept of grace is something that is just kind of, it's given, it's God's grace is available to everyone, whether you believe, don't believe, whatever the case is. Virtue is something that I see as also coming as a result of the free will that God gave us. So there's a choice involved there. In Muslim understanding of prophets and religious figures, whether it's Solomon or Abraham or Moses or anyone, we don't believe that they committed acts of, how can I say, carnal acts or committed immoral acts or any of these types of things, because they were role models. God had chosen them as role models. So when we talk about virtue, these were virtuous individuals. The virtue was there because they chose to be upright and they chose to do that. So I see it as involving free will and involving choice.
Can I just really quickly pick back? I think when we think about the shared figures, and we think about Hagar, we think about Abraham, and we think about Mary, and we think about Jesus, and we think about we just think when we think about grace, a lot of times we equate it to something good or something nice happening, God's grace. But sometimes, let's get away from good or bad, because to them it might have not been like the ideal of like that's good. And I think about when we think about it in terms of today, practical terms of today, we think about cause and effect. And oftentimes we equate grace to something great that happens to me. And we think about virtue as the response to free will, as Janan just spoke about. But the virtue in the character in all of them was that grace, what happened to them, the effect was they drew closer to God. They grew closer to it. And whereas sometimes we may go the opposite way. We may say, well, I feel like God has forsaken me. I feel like God is not around because of something bad that's happened to me. I think for a lot of us to say, don't mistake Him grace for just what you think of as like winning the lottery or something, like you just receive something, but there might be some challenges. I think a young brother in Dr. Kim, after your first class, there was a young man who stayed back and talked about his immigrant journey in this country. And he kind of was talking about his immigrant parents and his sister who's not understanding and how he's caught up in the middle. And one of the conversations that we had was, this is a challenge that you uniquely can take on. You understand your sister and you understand your parents. You understand all of the dynamics, and don't feel like just because right now you're taking this on that it's necessarily a bad thing. The man you're going to become in the future is going to be shaped by what you do right now. So understand that as God's grace.
I don't know if this works with what you put out there, Jorge, or not, but immediately what came to my mind, a figure that came to my mind after I listened to Samir was Rahab. And so this idea of like virtue, when I think about virtue, or you think of like who's a virtuous person, this person is so virtuous. So we pick Abraham, you think, oh, this is such a good virtuous person, that of course they would be in line for good things and God's blessings or whatever. But then you get Rahab, who was a prostitute, but I think virtue and righteousness was counted to her because of this obedience, because she was able to help the Israelites at a time where they needed some help in war. So I think that sometimes even I think this is coming to me actually from you, Dr. Omar, this conversation about Hagar. It's like who we look at and who we think about as being virtuous, and why do we think that person is a virtuous person? So I really think what it is, as Janan mentioned, is free will. Is in that moment, even though Rahab maybe had not been seen as a virtuous person in the town, they wouldn't have thought about her in that way because she was a prostitute. But later righteousness was counted to her. It's in that space that we allow ourselves to maybe some things what you were saying, Party, she had the grace at the moment. She was graced in that particular moment, at that particular time, to make the right kind of call that helped the children of Israel get what they needed in that particular moment. So I don't know. That's just kind of where my mind went. Let that do whatever it does, but that's just kind of where my mind went with that.
I'll add too that I think I remember growing up with the this idea that God calls ordinary people. And I remember learning about that even further at my time at Marquette, learning about the Jesuits and learning about saints in the Catholic Church, this idea that ordinary people, get called to do amazing works. And that is it. And almost, I think part of that virtue is in people is having, it's a concept that I've recently learned about in psychology, and tolerance of uncertainty. So the ability to step into that call or, that vision, and be uncomfortable, feel awkward, be brave, try to find faith in that. I think, part of that, a virtue we should talk about is faith, and having that faith to step into those uncomfortable and often scary moments, and being open to the fact that ordinary people get called into those spaces.
Well, let me just say one other thing. I think I agree with what has been shared so far, but I think virtue is rooted in a person's willingness to take on self-suffering. And I think that you could see in the lives, especially when Jorge is asking about these figures that we're discussing. They were not only willing, but they were, talk about grace, but there's personal agency involved. It's not like they were robots, they were prepared, strong enough to withstand these challenges. I think they had to bring it out from from inside. And so I think that element has to be considered, the willingness to take on self-suffering, not self-harm, self-suffering. And people have already mentioned steadfastness, right? The sticking to the principles that are important, regardless of what the consequences. Willingness to give up life, but not give up principles. I think that's where the virtue is rooted. So.
Thank you. So those are all the questions we have.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone that stayed on. Thank you thank you to everyone, the panelists. It just at some point I just stopped kind of thinking about my reaction and really just started journaling and thinking, reflecting. The sort of just the question about grace and virtue is just a beautiful place to end, and it gives us a reflective thought of the work that we all can do going forward, and showing up for yourself. There's going to be people who are watching right now that are going through again, that as you described, Dr. Omar, that self-suffering, not that self-harm, but to be there for your family, your community, your faith community, but also be there for yourself. And we thank you for joining us, and may you all be blessed.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.